Hey guys, I am Caleb Giddings,
And I'm Keith Finch.
and you are watching or listening to Gunday Brunch, probably on YouTube, because that's where the metrics say most of you are, and the metrics say the second largest number of you are on iTunes. So thanks for watching or listening. And if you're watching the visual version, you're about to see an ad banner. And if you're just listening, nothing happened, and we're going to get right into today's show. But first, before we get into today's show, let's just take a moment to quietly celebrate the fact that David Chipman's nomination got pulled. And I know we haven't talked about it on the show, but fuck that guy. So
That guy.
yeah, but I did want to hit on this very briefly before we get into today's much more fun episode. The nomination of David Chipman getting pulled is an example that ground level activism still works and we can still win. And calling your senators and writing your senators, and maybe we have had this conversation and I was just hallucinating that we didn't before, but calling your senators and writing your senators actually can have an effect, especially if enough of you do it and you don't copy paste someone else's message. So that nomination got pulled not because that nomination didn't get pulled because Republicans were opposed to him. That nomination got pulled because moderate Democrats were like, I'm not hot on this guy.
It worked, guys. The long and short of it is it worked. And what we're seeing here is we've racked up quite a series of wins, which doesn't mean our job is done by any means. We still have to keep on this. We still have to keep up the pressure when it comes to the various issues. But we've seen ATF rules get proposed and pulled. We've seen over 250,000 comments go up on some of the recent ATF rules, the vast majority of which, as far as I could tell, were in opposition. I know a campaign was launched in, I believe, the frame rules case by the demanding moms who demand mom things.
It's the worst
But
name ever.
It was largely people opposed the rule, and for good reasons. And you guys wrote it all out. And this pressure, this constant pressure, is going to keep us racking up wins. We're not going to win everything, especially in places like California or New York that are controlled legislatively entirely against this. But even there, even in New York, we are lining up for, if all the cards land right, a big win coming up with the Supreme Court starting in November. So
fingers crossed for that one.
It's a really good time to keep very smart, very articulate pressure on all these political leaders, because they are accountable. They just have to be accountable to enough of us. They have to know enough of us care.
Yup. Yeah, no,
and
I mean,
with that,
and with that, now let's get into the topic of today's episode, which is Keith and Caleb debate about the three most overrated guns of all time. So there's guns, like everything, have fandoms, and sometimes these fandoms are stupid, and they think that, and they think that these guns are better than they are. And so we're going to talk about what guns may be overrated. And I think that some of these guns, like my list is guns that you may not think of when you think of overrated guns, but I'm going to make a case for them. And I have no idea what Keith has on his list. So how this is going to work is we're each going to toss out a gun, and then we're going to decide which one is actually more overrated. And that's going to be how the list goes. So let's say, all right, Keith, what's your number 3? And then I'll give you my number 3, and then we'll talk.
All right. Number 3 was hard for me to pick out because I have this, there's historical context guns, and then there's modern firearms that I also consider overrated. But for the number 3, it's a historical context gun, and it's the M1 Garand.
Oh,
the Garand. Good old John Garand.
Okay, so my number 3 is actually the child of the M1 Garand, and it's the M14.
Oh yes, this is going to go.
So we're really close on this one.
This is going to go so well. Oh,
right,
I love it.
Why do you think the M1 is overrated? Because I disagree. I don't disagree. If this was a top 5 list, the M1 probably would have been number 5 for me.
Yep. Now, the reason the M1 Garand is overrated, the reason is overrated is because its reputation has been greatly inflated over time. There is no doubt, and the numbers show it in its acceptance trials, in how it performed, that in the 1940s, when it was being used as the greatest battle rifle of all time, cats.
In the 1940s, greatest battle rifle of all time.
Yep. Cut and back in. In the 1940s, when the M1 Garand was being used as the greatest battle rifle implement of all time, it objectively was, compared to its other 30 cal-ish bolt action counterparts that were used as general infantry rifles. It had a comparative effective range and a substantially great rate of fire. Substantially greater rate of fire. So a U.S. infantry squad armed with M1 Garands could shoot the living shit around any other infantry squad that was running bolt guns. Plain and simple.
Okay, so those are like literally all my arguments for why it's not overrated and why it probably doesn't belong at number 3.
Here's the reason it's overrated.
Okay.
Do you know what the actual M1 Garand stoppage rate was when it was accepted?
I don't know, 1 in 500?
1 in 8.
What? Like it would stop at least once per clip?
It would stop 1 per 8 shots.
That's once a clip.
Yep.
It's an 8-shot clip. And one of the things that is dumb about the M1 Garand that I will pile on here for just a second is the fact that the end block clips are stupid. I'm sorry. I said it. They make a cool noise and they look neat, but it's a dumb design because you can't top the rifle off.
John Garand wanted to use magazines. John Garand also wanted to use it and make it in 276.
Yeah. Should have probably stuck with those ideas because it'd be better.
Yeah, those were really good ideas. We could have been a lot farther ahead.
And if it had been more, and I hate to say this, if it had been more SKS style where you load it into a fixed magazine with stripper clips, that would have been better.
Yep. And what it came down to is during the evaluation and testing of this thing, what it ultimately came down to is, even though the stoppage rate of the Garand at the time was 1 in 8 on average, it still maintained a rate of fire because it was really easy to clear. Like it doesn't bang, oh, oops, charge it or load another strip or load another end block and you're ready to go. You were still able to operate that rifle 4 or 5 times faster than a 1903. So it didn't matter. It had a 1 in 8 stoppage rate. You were still like 60 rounds to 5 against other rifles. So it still just shot circles around the comparative rifles. Therefore, greatest battle rifle implement of all time for the 1940s.
So your case for why it's
my case for why it's overrated is people don't properly appreciate that compared to today's standards, it's not that good anymore.
It was
now,
great
most
for the
Garands
time
that I've encountered with the good ammo and everything like that don't stop at 1 in 8 rates. They're usually better than that. I haven't seen, I don't shoot a lot of 30-06 and I don't shoot a lot of M1 Garands, but the last time I did, I think I had 4 or 5 stoppages on old, weaker pressure ammo. And then I had no stoppages on a Garand load, but with modern new in the box ammo.
Yeah, that's another thing with the Garand. You can't shoot, just like I can't go to the gun store and buy 30-06 and stick it in there because it'll blow the gun up.
It's too much.
Yeah, too much.
Too spicy.
The greatest battle rifle of all time can't handle just, ammo that a 14-year-old girl will shoot out of a 6-pound bolt action rifle. Interesting. So I'm leaning into this. I'm liking this opinion. So my argument for the M14 is not nearly as coherent. It's mostly because the M14 sucks, and
I agree with you there.
And it objectively sucks because the only reason the M14 existed was, if you guys go back and listen to our episode on why 308 kind of sucks, the only reason the M14 existed as a rifle is basically for the same reasons that 308 exists, is because Army want 30 cal bullet and Army no want small small rifle. Army want big manly rifle that do manly things. But the thing was uncontrollable on full auto, and I mean uncontrollable on full auto. The magazine sucked. They were unreliable. It wouldn't feed. Everyone's like, "Oh, it was better in the jungles." My ass, it was. My ass. It had an open operating system. You want to tell me that worked better in Vietnam than the fully enclosed operating system of the M16? Get that and get out of my face. Get directly out of my face.
To give more ammunition to your argument here on why it may in fact beat out the M1 Garand as an overrated platform, they touted that they could build these fucking M14s on M1 Garand tooling, and you can't at all. The gas system's completely different. They just look similar on the outside. It's the same as like the PSL and the Dragunov rifles. They look very similar.
When you said PSL, I thought you were doing like a pumpkin spice latte thing. I was very confused.
Yeah, the PSL 54, the Romanian elongated AK that shoots 7.62 by 54R, was their attempt at doing the Russian SVD Dragunov, which actually was a different short stroke gas piston system. But they look exteriorly very similar, and they shoot the same round. You look at the M1 Garand and the M14, and exteriorly they look very similar. Their gas system completely different. The Garand uses a full stroke piston gas system. The M14 is a short stroke one, and it never worked super well.
And the only reason the M14 is popular today is because of stupid people who think that somehow being a 30 caliber battle rifle makes it a better defensive implement than a modern, well-made M16 clone or an M4 clone or an AR-15 or something like that. I wouldn't even hate 308 if we had just been smart and just adopted the FAL like the rest of NATO, and we'd be like, oh, okay, cool. That gun looks awesome. Give me one of those. Because you know what the FAL is? More controllable in full auto. You know what else the FAL is? More reliable. It's almost like the M14 was just this shoddy bullshit thrown together that because we wanted to have a 30 cal rifle, because we foisted 308 on the rest of NATO. We're like, no, we're America.
They accepted it because we promised them we would pick up the FAL.
Yeah.
We essentially, they're like, look, we hate your round choice. We hate the 308. We want our 280. We hate it. We hate the 308, but we will take and we will retool the FALs, which were originally built in 280. And then the British did the EM2 in 280. So Europe was all 280, but they're like, look, America, we will take your bullshit 30 cal and we will all keep 30 cal if you just adopt the FAL with the rest of us so that we can have a common rifle for NATO. And, you know, this whole NATO thing that we're coming up with where it's all like interchangeable and we can use each other's stuff, we can do it. And America's like, yep, except no.
Except also, fuck you. Yeah. So the M14 sucks and I hate it. I hate everything about it. It's stupid. And when the Air Force bought the M16 and was like, this is a handy round for our law enforcement security patrols. This is a good little rifle. And then the Army woke up and was like, oh shit, it is a good rifle. And then the Army tried to ruin the M16, which we could do a whole podcast about how the Army Ordnance Board intentionally, this wasn't an accident, intentionally tried to sabotage the adoption of the M16 because they wanted to keep the M14, which the M14 sucked. It had a higher stoppage rate. It had a higher parts breakage rate. Everything about the M14 is objectively worse than the M16, except for the fact that the 30 cal round is marginally more effective at 600 meters.
Yes. And this is not to say the M1 Garand's a bad rifle, because it's not. It was a great rifle, especially in its day. And this is not to say that the M14, when adopted, didn't work. They made it work, but it was a maintenance intensive nightmare. Like these things were expensive to upkeep. You look at the parts lists and everything they had to buy to keep these guns running. They kept them running, but they were expensive as hell. And then you look at what you need to keep M16s running, and it's like, no, I get it.
All right. So what do you think? You think M1 Garand more overrated or M14's more overrated? I like your arguments for the M1. I'm leaning on the M14 as being more overrated because the
M14 as more overrated as well. We're going to give it to the M14 on this one because objectively, especially for their time frames, and for their adoptions and the reasons why they're adopted. The M1 Garand was adopted for very, very good reasons. And you can objectively see that in its testing and its adoption. And despite its 1 in 8 at the time, stoppage rate with the ammunition and everything for the day, it outshot all of its competition.
Right.
They had to basically limp the M14 through its competition against the FAL during its cold weather trials. They gave it the special lubes where they really didn't on the FN trial one. And then they did, and when the AR-10 was being submitted, nobody looked at it and said, you submitted something with an aluminum barrel. Do you want to try again? Should we look at this? Because Fairchild, Armalite, the division of Fairchild at the time, was doing crazy things, and they were all mad space scientists, and they're like, let's try aluminum for everything. And there were material scientists who were like, no, this is a bad idea. We need the properties of steel to make this work. And they're like, no, it'll be fine. This is only a military acceptance trial.
It's be great.
And so we probably should have had the FAL. We probably never should have had 308. And because of those things, the M14 is more overrated. And I don't know how many Vietnam Navy SEALs I've met, but it's more than actually existed in Vietnam.
Right.
And I don't know how many Vietnam veterans I met who tossed their M16 into the grass the minute they got to Vietnam, and they went back to the armory and got an M14, but
First of all, no, you didn't, because it wasn't there. Yeah. All right. So criteria for this one, the M14 is more overrated because in its time, the M1 was actually a good rifle, and the M14 in its time wasn't, but yet people still think of it like it was a good rifle.
Mm-hmm. And it's nostalgia for the 30 cal, and it's nostalgia for the M1 Garand that drives that, because rifles should have wood stocks and be made of steel and not this crazy plastic stuff and aluminum that works freaking phenomenally.
Right. All right. So number 3 on our list of the most overrated guns of all time, the M14. I'll throw out my number 2 candidate, and I'm going to apologize in advance to fans of The Patriot, which is one of my favorite movies, by the way. But the Pennsylvania/Kentucky rifle, depending on what nomenclature you want to use for it, is hella overrated in a historical context. All right, guys, super overrated. And here's why. We didn't actually use it for the war. We didn't. All right. While rifles were used in very, 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 very small numbers by extremely specialized guerrilla units, by and large, you know what won us the fucking Revolutionary War? 69 caliber French muskets, the Charleville musket. We started off with Brown Bess muskets that we took from British armories, and then we were like, these kind of suck. Let's get our own. And we bought a piss load of Charleville muskets from the French, and that was what we won the war with. We won the war with traditional infantry tactics of the time, not Mel Gibson sneaking around behind trees, chopping people's heads off and shooting them with Kentucky rifles or Pennsylvania rifles, again, depending on the nomenclature that you want to use. Secondly, the motherfuckers are really hard to reload in a hurry. They were, as an implement of war in the way warfare was actually fought at the time, the Pennsylvania rifle sucked. You couldn't reload it as fast as a musket. It would foul much quicker than a musket because it was rifled, making it more accurate. And when the fighting invariably turned to hand-to-hand combat, which it always did back then, because combat doctrine was shoot 2, maybe 3 times, then charge them with bayonets and have a stab fight, which sounds like a terrible way to fight a war. When you eventually close to hand-to-hand combat, the very few riflemen that you had in your unit had an extremely flimsy weapon. If you look at a Pennsylvania rifle and how it's constructed versus a Charleville musket or a Brown Bess musket, the Brown Bess musket and the Charleville muskets are big hunks of wood and steel. They're meaty, they're thick, because you're designed to be able to thrust and parry with them. Compare that with like a rifle of the period, it's much more fragile. The stocks would break if you tried to hit somebody with them. You could shatter the foregrips. You could even bend the barrels in some cases, trying to use them as an impact weapon, which is why the British outfitted their designated riflemen, who, by the way, the British combat rifle of that time was so much better than our rifles because it was shorter, it was easier to load, and it was actually designed for combat. It wasn't a fucking hunting rifle that was pressed into military service. But the British riflemen of that time also carried fucking swords because when it turned into a stab fight, which it always did, they needed to be able to fight on an equal level with the guys who had a 4-foot long musket with an 18-inch long triangular bayonet. But we have this love affair with the Pennsylvania rifle because the way people grew up thinking about the Revolutionary War was that it wasn't won by traditional infantry tactics. It was won by Mel Gibson sneaking around in the bushes, sniping the British. And that's just not fucking factually accurate. And it pisses me off because it takes away from the understanding of the evolution of infantry tactics. So I've owned a Kentucky rifle. It was a beautiful thing. I've shot some gorgeous guns. They're wonderful. They're beautiful historical artifacts, but it didn't fucking win the war. Your turn.
I'm still going to watch it every July 4th, though. I love
Absolutely. Absolutely. I stand Mel Gibson.
Cut every time.
I stand Mel Gibson murders the English 100% of the time. I like his prequel too that's set in Scotland. All right. I love him. Okay.
Fantastic. Mel Gibson,
one of my favorite
English. We're on board.
It is one of my favorite movies of all time. And it actually, some of the scenes actually do a fairly decent job of depicting combat from the era. You know, if you take out the final battle where Mel Gibson single-handedly wins the Battle of Cowpens, which is whatever, but okay. But anyway, no, I love the movie, but it drives me nuts how this rifle is lionized as like winning the Revolutionary War, when in fact it was a limited participant at best. And a lot of guys in these irregular guerrilla units would toss their rifles or put them in storage at the first opportunity to get a musket because muskets were better for fucking fighting.
Got to concern yourself with the mechanics and the logistics. Those
exactly. All right, what's your number two?
My number two is the vaunted, loved by the Wolverines, AK-47.
Oh God. Did it just get cold in here? Are people outside with torches and fucking pitchforks right now, guys? Are we going?
Almost assuredly. I can feel a chill breeze blowing through the mitten here. And I'm sure I receive a sharp knock upon my door. But it's the AK rifle.
All of Brandon Herrera's subscribers are coming to your house right now.
They are. And and especially after Mike and Brandon have done a lot of good AK content recently. Like the AK, we'll put this out there, guys. The AK isn't a bad rifle by any means. I own a few. They're good rifles, but they're overrated rifles. They're one of those that have developed this legendary reputation for you can't break them. They will survive anything. And let me tell you, that's just not fucking true. These things break and they go down hard. They have a similar reputation in a lot of ways to the invincible revolver. You can't stop a revolver. Revolvers never break. They never die. And I'm insulting Caleb's love of all things right now.
I've broken like 4 revolvers this year. Get out of my face. Revolvers break.
Yep. And when an AK breaks, it usually breaks hard. And when you look at it and you look at the repairs that you have to do with an AK and you look at the logistics, it's usually easier in many cases to toss an AK than it is to repair an AK. Because if you get damage into the front trunnion, like if it's a bolt issue, which it might be a bolt issue, that's usually an easy fix. But if it isn't a bolt issue and it's something in the front trunnion, like you either have to press out and press in a front trunnion, or you take the easy route and you yeet the fucking rifle after 6,000 to 16,000 rounds, depending on how well it was built. And you just get yourself a new rifle because it's fairly cost effective to do that. My first experience with this was many years ago when I was in Africa training with the Moroccan Royal Army, and we were asking them about our maintenance procedures because the United States military is very logistics and very maintenance heavy. And so when an M16 breaks, we go fix it.
Right.
Just like when a truck breaks, we go fix it. And we started asking the Moroccans, and they got this like stupidest deer in the headlights face about it. Like,
what do you mean
and
fix it?
Yeah, and that was literally their like colonel there who was with us goes, we don't fix, we just get a new one. And I was like, oh, okay. And their use of the rifle at the time, their annual use of the rifle consisted of 10 rounds, 3 to make sure it shot in the correct direction and 7 for score.
Yeah,
so they were not using the rifles very heavy to begin with. So sure, these rifles, these military rifles might last 10, 20, 30 years. But in 30 years, it saw 300 rounds unless it deployed and went to combat. It saw 300 rounds. If it was assigned to one soldier and taken out by one soldier the whole time it was there. If it was given to 10 soldiers to shoot during that time period, it still only saw 3,000 rounds, which is only half of what an expected service life on a very poorly built AK might be. But if you look at maintenance numbers out of places like Machine Gun Las Vegas and other places that run guns really, really hard, you start to see that the AK is just another well-built rifle. And it breaks down and it has problems and it has issues, just like other modern infantry fighting rifles. It just landed at the party a little earlier than a lot of them. And it hasn't gone through a lot of the same upgrade phases until recently that like the AR-15 arc took in the 90s and into the early 2000s. Now it's catching up and it's in a peer group again. And it just comes down to the fact that it had this legendary reputation that you couldn't stop it, and you absolutely fucking can't.
I'm kind of buying into this here. So back when I owned a gun store, we had full auto rentals, and I had a gold-plated AK, which was very cool, and also broke all the fucking time, and it would stop all the time. The most reliable of my machine gun rentals was the Mac 10. Which was also impossible to control. Like more people shot the seal. Oh Jesus! Yep. But the I'm starting to buy on this AK thing, and I think a lot of the reason I'm buying into it too because I think a lot of the reasons why people love the AK and what also makes the AK overrated is actually related to why people like the M14, and it's AR-15 contrarianism.
Yeah.
Where they're like,
and there's some mystique to it, and you get almost the same story about dudes who picked up an AK in Vietnam versus dudes who tossed their M16 into the woods to grab an M14, and the 10,000 Navy SEALs that I've met when there were like 111. So you get a lot of people who are absolutely selling you a pile of crap over either the AK or back to the M14, just because they heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy. And now I'm talking to this dude who's on the other side of the counter at a gun store, and he clearly wants to hear this story that I'm making up about, Vietnam or whatever, or how the AK is definitely the best rifle for the end of the world. And one of those is still a continuing love of 30 cal, because the Russians didn't get rid of 30 cal either. And they haven't since 1892 or something like that, when 7.62-54 first hit. They're still using that, and then they're using the shortened version. But that makes sense in the Russian mindset, where like the units that are still using 7.62 by 39, which is not all of them, they're 5.45s, their main rifle round with the 74s and the upgraded AKs. But those units that are still using by 39, and then their former con block nations that are all still using by 39, it's just because it's easy. It's really, really easy. And that was their whole thing. It was easy and it was good enough. Where the American arguments were really like, hey, we know better, but we like it.
I think I'm going to agree that the AK-47 is more overrated than the Kentucky rifle because for two reasons. One, the Kentucky rifle as a product of its time, was the most accurate battlefield implement, that was out there,
Mhm.
and was also did enjoy American iconic status. And two, the other reason I'm going to agree with you is like 7 years ago, I wrote an article called The Five Most Overrated Guns of All Time and put the AK at number 3. So obviously, we have some parallel thinking on this one. So far, our list, guys, is number 3, the M14, number 2, the AK-47. And I'm very curious to hear what your number 1 is, because I know what mine is, and it's going to upset a lot of people. But I'll let you go first on this one, and let's see what we come out with number
part one of the most overrated guns ever, where we got through guns number 3 and number 2. Tune in next week for part 2 in the series, where we discuss the most overrated gun. We had to cut this episode for time because it was getting a little long when we got into the most overrated gun. So make sure you guys come back next week. Thank you, everyone, for watching, sharing, and subscribing. See you next week, guys.